Hello, everyone. This is Ed Breniger, and welcome to the Eddy Network podcast. I'm delighted today to have J.R. Dunmore with me, uh, and I'll let J.R. figure out how we were introduced to one another, um, and tell you that. But I'm glad to have you here. He's an author, he's a magazine producer, and I think you're going to find him very interesting. And so glad to have you here, J.R. Thank you for taking some time to spend with me on this day.
Oh, of course. Well, thank you for having me. This is my first opportunity to do something like this outside of print anyway, so I'm happy to do it. Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about yourself. Like where you live. Kind
Mhm.
of the things that put us in a context for conversation.
Yeah, for sure. So well, I could go back pretty far. My family's been in Virginia since the 1630s.
Well,
Although we weren't always in the Shenandoah Valley. At one point, we were on the West Virginia side for about 100-year stretch before coming back over. Um, Dad's family is from up north, but he was raised here, and he is, every bit as Southern as I am in behavior and attitudes. Um, let's see here. I am from Shenandoah County. I said that. I work in the ag industry by day. So we farm and finish crop products into consumer goods essentially. So I'm part of the entire chain from farm to table essentially. So it can be rewarding work, but what I care more about is what I do at night, which is run the magazine. So Virginia Gentry, and we're a I don't know, paleo conservative, and I use that as a preface because I think while the core focus of the magazine is Southern heritage, Southern history, Southern culture, um, there is a traditional worldview that we try to promote. So we're not overtly political, but we have a bend, if that makes sense. Um, but yeah, it's a lot of fun. I love um, you know love the history, love the Civil War history. People submit articles. I'll, read them and edit, and if they make the cut, they'll make it onto the magazine. We're hoping to move to print here in the spring, but we'll see. We'll see how that goes. And one of my favorite things to do in the magazine is book reviews, which is actually how I came into contact with Troop. So this Christmas, I was extremely busy. Lots of trips to relatives and so on, and was really struggling to find time to write anything substantial for the magazine. So I decided I was going to do a three-part gift guide, so that people who wanted to buy gifts for anybody who might be interested would have some ideas. And most of it's, I think I did two. I think I did two that were just books, two whole gift guides that were just books, and then I did a third one for little knickknacks and things. But it was all centered around. Essentially, I opened it up with if you are a reader of the magazine or someone you know reads the magazine and they showed you this, consider purchasing one of these things for them as a potential gift. And I had not read Victory Runes yet, but I had included it in my list. And the reason for that is a friend of mine who I trust when it comes to books made the claim that Victory Runes was an excellent book. So didn't feel any concern putting it on there, even though I hadn't read it. And I'd planned to do a review of it before that. And Troop saw the article through social media and reached out to me and sent me the book so that I could get on it. And that's actually how we ended up meeting. So after I read it and reviewed it, you reached out to me through Substack, and it's great. Victory Ruins is an incredible book.
just so that those of you who are watching can get into this encounter that we're having. Victory Ruins is a novel that my oldest son, Troop Breniger, wrote. I guess it came out a couple of years ago, and you can find a interview that I did with him when it first came out. It was pre Eddie Network podcast time, but it's been included in the network in the podcast. And it's a story of a family, farm family in Catawba County, North Carolina, and he's trying to tell a story about what it what the experience of being a farmer in many, and correct me if I'm wrong, in many sense, he's describing what subsistence farming was like before
Yeah,
the
absolutely.
Second World War.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so that's what he wrote about, and the stories about the young man who on the farm who loves the farm. That's all that he's interested in. Second World War starts, and he joins the reserves, thinking that that'll keep him from going to war, but it doesn't. And he ends up spending 3.5 years in the military and fights in the Battle of the Bulge. And it's a story of of well, I'll just leave it at the title describes the outcome.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. It's a poignant book. I loved it. I really, really loved it. But I mean, if you read my review, and one of the things that I go into is a little bit of my family history and how, our family farm over the years has been broken up, and that was not that that happens to Troop. I don't want to give away anything in the book, but that's a fear of his, having to see the thing that he loves dissolve. And I guess being that I had firsthand experience in that, it was very uh, that was like a mirror almost, I guess.
Well, let me ask you this. You describe yourself as a paleo conservative,
Yes, sir.
which is, but my sense is that's not a reflection of a political stance. It's more of a cultural stance.
Yeah, I would say that.
And, and I've described myself as a pre-modern post-Marxist for the very same reason. Not necessarily that I'm conservative or liberal or any. I just think those categories,
Hmm.
ideologies are not well suited to the world we live in today.
Oh, certainly. I think, for me, I mean, I think you're right in what you said about it's more of a cultural outlook. And or I guess maybe if you want to break it down with conservatism, to think of it as trying to maintain what we have, right? Trying to conserve something. And I feel like paleo, you're reaching back to an older tradition, something that was lost in the years, but it's trying to restore and hold on to what we have left. And I think that's whether it's cultural substrata, like growing up in the South and you know that way of life between in Troop's book, for example, the main character wanting to hold on to you know the family farm in the late 30s. It's just so I think that's a fair that's oh, I'm sorry if you hear footsteps. My daughter just ran down the hall.
Okay, all right.
But
It's a
essentially, yeah.
normal conversation. It's a
Yeah.
normal.
But I think that would be probably the better way to surmise it. You
So
know.
you grew up on a family farm.
Kind of. I grew up on the remains of a farm. So when my father was growing up, it was still a farm. By the time I came around, it had been divided three times. What the largest portion sold off. My grandfather kept, I want to say 30 couple acres. But there's a house right in the center of it, had a stable, and so most of it couldn't be farmed. I think now they cut hay on a portion of it, but my aunt and uncle who live there just they're horse people, so they keep they keep horses. But that's what my grandfather did. He raised horses, but I wouldn't call him a horse person if that's fair. My father. Anyway, sorry, I'm getting away from it. So the family farm got split up again, and where portion was given to my father, and that's where I grew up. And n no tract was big enough to do any real farming on. We still did farm work at that point, but my dad grew up raising livestock with my grandfather, and my uncle got into crop and then got my dad into it. So we've been into crop farming since It's been over 20 years. I mean, it's 2025. It's been over 25 years. I don't know quite how long, but we've been doing that for a pretty long time now. Getting away from livestock. My dad hated horses, so he did not want to keep that going.
That
Um,
is it hard to manage a horse farm as opposed to
no,
a farm?
he just didn't like dealing with them. Uh, and I think that they're ornery. He always liked cattle, and they're a little less particular. Um, it didn't work out for him, at least at the time. That's how he got on the crop. But now, we're talking about he's thinking about getting cows, which I think is funny. But he's always loved cows. He just never had a place for them. But we'll see.
So what do you think about there's this kind of movement that's been ongoing for, I don't know, 10, 15 years of young people wanting to go to farming. They buy some land and they start farming. And these are city people who have
Hmm.
decided they want a rural lifestyle and they want to farm. Um, what do you think about that?
Well,
You know
I
what they're
think
doing?
it's great so long as they do it right. Well, that's the thing. I mean, the rate of success is slim, unless you're going to be beyond subsistence, and that's always where the challenge is. The problem with subsistence farming is we don't live in an economy that can support subsistence farming. You got to pay your taxes and your Social Security and so on, and it's not like it was 100 years ago.
Yeah.
And for that reason, I think it's difficult because if you want to well, I'll put it like this: all of the subsistence farmers that I know do work on the side to supplement their income, which is not ideal for somebody who wants to be a subsistence farmer. Uh, I know one gentleman in particular who makes very, very good money doing what he does. On the side, he's a bookbinder and he does, special editions of books. So he does some beautiful work, but that is how he pays all the bills and taxes and so on. Because here's the deal, as a subsistence farmer, even if you make enough, produce enough, high enough a yield to make some kind of profit, um, if that's not immediately absorbed into shoeing horses or fixing implements or whatever, when you have to pay that property tax, you may lose your farm. It's not it's tricky, and I think many people don't make it. I wish more people would. I like that. I hate to see these mega farms, where there's or corporations rather buying up lots and lots of small acreages to kind of make these super farms because I feel like that's just as detrimental to the family farm as, you know, anything else. I think it's a good impulse. I want more people to succeed. I also don't want to see people who grew up on multi-generational farms lose their land. I think for me that's more important than having somebody who wants to try homesteading come out of Washington D.C. or New York City and take a crack at it. But I'm very conscious of place and what it means, and that's even been a challenge for me growing up where I grew up here in Shenandoah County because like I said, like my roots are in the valley, but long ago, my family came back to the valley probably 30, 40 years before I was born. Might have even been a little longer than that. It was a little longer than that. About 50, 55 years before I was born, I want to say. And but even, it seems like a long time, but when you're dealing with, at the county fair, everybody knows everybody and who are you? Like stuff
Yeah.
like that. And I don't think that that's bad per se. I don't feel like anybody should have to, be forced to make friends with anybody if they don't want to or whatever. But it is a challenge when going to a new place. I also think that's why you see a lot of these homestead types so active on social media. I don't know if you're familiar with that phenomena, but YouTube is full of vlogs and stuff from these people who left the cities and wanted to start these little farms. And I feel like that community is kind of grown up out of the fact that these we'll say legacy farms are less. or maybe more suspicious of them than they would be of each other. I'm just talking, so I have no idea this.
Well, no, you're right on the money because what you're describing is a you're you're painting for us a picture in words of the changes that have been going on in society, and it's never in one direction. It's always in
Mhm,
many different directions. And for people, you know, I mean, for a long time in this 20th century, the movement was to the cities, where that's where the opportunities are. And
mhm,
but since, the last maybe 20 years, there's been some of this movement to the county, to the country.
mhm,
Um, and I lived in Wyoming for a while, and I saw some of that there. Um, and what I think people don't realize is how hard it is,
mhm.
how risky, financially risky it is. I mean,
Oh,
if you have a lot of money and you can afford to toss away $1 million,
well, that's the thing. Nobody farms to make money.
Right. So I've bought meat from a farm in a ranch in Ten Sleep, Wyoming, and they do a good job,
Oh,
but
sure.
that's how they have been able to farm is that they're sending beef cattle meat out, for people to consume.
Hmm.
You
I
know?
know a farm in Wyoming, a ranch there that my dad's friends with the owner, but I can't for the life of me remember his name. But he sells all of his beef to Las Vegas. Gets sold to the casinos, and it makes him good money, you know. But I think uh, stuff like that, and even like stuff like my family, we've been blessed to find our place, in the ecosystem, as it
Yeah,
were, to be successful enough to justify doing it.
yeah,
A lot of people and a lot of farmers I know locally are, it's roll the dice whether or not the crop is good or a few years back we had a really, really, really dry year and it was really, really hard on everybody. But stuff like that. That's stuff that you can't really prepare for. Crop insurance is there for a reason. But it can be difficult to lose things like that, or it's very stressful, I'd say, farming like that. So like I said, we don't really farm our own ground now, so we're essentially sharecroppers, which is kind of a blessing because the other farmers that we work with on the ground help manage everything, and we're in, relationship with them, and we talk a lot about, atmospheric conditions, how's the crop looking, this, that, and the other, because what they do affects what we do, and so on and so on. So it's takes a little bit of the pressure off, but you got to be really conscious of all that. So, yeah.
you said that your family originally came in the 1630s.
Hmm.
Where'd they come from?
Almost entirely from Scotland. On my mom's side. Now my dad's side was English with a little bit of Welsh and Irish, but my mom's side is entirely Scottish. I think there might be one or two Irish people in her family, and came
Where
into. Go ahead.
where in Scotland she came from?
Um, Argyle, and there's one other place where most of them came from, but they all came down into what is now Virginia, North Carolina, and worked their way west into the Appalachians. So that's my grandparents were in. So they were both born and raised in Kanawha, or Charleston, West Virginia
Yeah,
area. Yeah, and they left there for Ohio to get work in the auto industry. As you're talking about the fleeing of the rural areas for work to the cities,
yeah.
and they did that for a number of years. And when that was no longer viable, well, but at that point, my mom had married my dad. We were back here in the county, which I think is really funny that through my mom marrying my father, it brought her back to where her roots were. Even though they had, my dad's family ended up here for a totally different reason. But either way, it's all fascinating stuff. But yeah, it's
Does your family talk about those years? Talk about the stories? Is it? I mean, my father used to accuse me and Troop of being ancestry worshipers. Because our family, remembering our family, telling those stories, remember who they are and their impact upon us meant
Hmm.
something to us. Still,
Oh,
it's
of course. My
um,
my grandfather, sorry to cut you off.
yeah, no, go ahead. Yeah,
I was just gonna say my grandfather and my grandmother talk very fondly about West Virginia. They do not talk very fondly about Ohio. And I think that's because they grew up in West Virginia. That's where their families were. My grandfather's people come from the Tug Valley, so Kentucky, and West Virginia border there.
yeah,
Um, and they all went into Charleston. So that was the first movement into the city was to go to Charleston to try to find work. And after being there for about a generation, they kind of scattered elsewhere. And that's how my grandfather ended up in Ohio for however many years working in the car factories. Yeah. So the as far as ancestor worship, it's the stories in West Virginia are remembered very fondly. Those are the ones that get told. I don't hear many from Ohio unless they're from my mother or an aunt. But that's where they would have grown up. And
we spent 7 years in West Virginia, and those are really good years. It's a great place to live, and
oh
there's
yeah,
good people there. Um, it's not like anywhere else I've ever lived except for Wyoming. And Wyoming's kind of the West Virginia of the West, and West Virginia's kind of the Wyoming of the East. And I've said that to people who have lived in both places. They said, "Yeah, that's kind of the way it is."
we
Because
I live.
there's
Oh,
still a rural culture
oh,
that
for sure.
honored in both places.
I'm probably, as I sit right now, I'm probably 15 or 20 miles at most from the West Virginia border. I can be there in about a half hour.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I'm not far at all. It's yeah, I love it, and I also love the Highlands of Virginia. Those are great places. It's a bit of a hike out there, but I love being up in the Appalachians, and people there are great. They remind me of what it was like here when I was a boy, if that makes sense.
Yes.
We've had a lot of change. We've had a lot of change just since I've been alive. I can't imagine my father or my grandfather what they've experienced. Living here and seeing that transformation. Especially my dad because he would have grown up kind of to see like the last of the real old like I mean he knew farmers. My dad grew up with a lot of farmers who didn't even have their social security cards and stuff because they were never given numbers at birth, just old men. And people like Troop describes in his book, and I wish I'd have got more of that growing up, but it was still a great childhood. But I love heading out that way because I think it's still there, like, the way it is there is like it was here, 30 years ago. Well,
My
anywho.
my mother's kin, my mother's father's kin are Scottish. They're
Hmm.
Morrisons, and there are three brothers that came over from the southern part of Scotland in 1750, and they all ended up in Cabarrus County, which is just north of Charlotte, and then they kind of spread out, and they're two old women. That's it's not derogatory. They're old Mark who have done the genealogical work, and if I knew where it was, I would. And there are these large books for each one of the brothers,
Hmm.
during their genealogy, since the 1750s. So it's an amazing work. It's really amazing, and what's interesting is that those Morrisons kind of percolated out into the mountains, and there's a cabin up on the Blue Ridge Parkway uh, north of here um, that um, is not a Morrison family relic. It is my father's family's relic. It's called the Brenniger cabin. And but what's interesting is that they were all in this area, of Piedmont, North Carolina. And so my father's family grew up in the Davie County, um, uh, Forsyth County, you know, Iredell County, all these counties here in the Piedmont area, north between Charlotte and Greensboro, let's just say.
Hmm.
And then my mother's father's family grew up in the same area and never had any, as far as we know, never had any interaction with one another until my parents met one another in around 1949, 1950. And so up there on the parkway where the Brenniger cabin is, it's a cousin, you have to go back about 4 generations, 5 generations. It's a cousin once removed, and he married a woman from up there in this place called Air Bellows Gap, and that's where this cabin is, and it's owned by the National Park Service now, and they do have a Brenniger Cabin Day every year, and it's really an interesting place. One of the wife's kin I have met, and he's a guy up who lives in Asheville, but he comes down for this thing, and he has taken me around Arabella's Gap to kind of introduce me to the not personally introduce me, but to tell the
Hmm.
stories of what happened in this area up there on the top of the mountains where the Blue Ridge Parkway passes through. And there's a graveyard there, and it's really fascinating because the family relationships that existed back then. So we're talking pre-Civil War. The family
Hmm.
relationships were not how we understand relationships today. And so the family was, in a sense, whoever lived with you. You know, and so
Hmm.
this one family that was kind of the Brenniger family that was the Krause family, who was kind of the dominant is the wrong word either, but they were kind of the main family of this. They also had a black family that was living with them. They weren't slaves. They were
Hmm.
they were just a family that kind of attached themselves to them, and they would do things together. And
Hmm.
so this mythology about slavery is is largely true in many respects, but it's not totally true. And there's always these
Hmm.
stories that kind of belie the oversimplification that political ideologies like to make about what goes on in the world.
Oh,
And
for sure.
and it's interesting. So there's one story I want to share because this is so we're talking, now almost 200 years ago, almost 200 years ago. And the father, Henderson Krause, sends the kind of the this boy who's, I think he's about 14 or 15, um, to Virginia to take another child who's probably 6 or 7, and he's going to take this little black teenager. Is going to take this white child up into Virginia to some family up there, and so they he gives them what they need to take, and off they go, and it kind of reminded me of something like Mark Twain would have written, or something that
Hmm.
Faulkner, William Faulkner would have written, but it's not a made up story. This is actually what and that black family is buried right there in the graveyard with all the other Krauses in Brenner.
Yeah, I
It's
mean, history, it's stranger than fiction. It's awesome. I mean, I love these old stories. I love these old stories. I wish I had more. My family on my mom's side was many of them were illiterate, just as where they came from. Up in the hollers in West Virginia and Kentucky, and the few that could read and write didn't, write down a whole lot for us. I'd love to compile a family genealogy at some point, but it's been tricky, especially my grandmother's family. I can't find once I get to her grandfather, the records just kind of dry up. Um, all I
well,
know is he was born in Kentucky. Go ahead.
my father's brother in the 1980s spent a lot of time. going to county seats all over North Carolina, and I think some in Virginia, some in Tennessee, some in Kentucky, looking for our families. And so he was able to put together, I think, 10 generations of the family in all of that. And these big boxes that washing machines and refrigerators.
Hmm.
Well, he's got this big piece of cardboard where it's all mapped out, and and that's part of this family. The importance of family, I think, to a lot of us is that we see these generations go from one generation to the next, and what we're seeing is that there are certain common things that are consistent from generation to generation, and those things are the things we treasure and the things we want
Hmm.
future generations to understand.
Certainly. Yeah, certainly. I think that I think that's probably one of the reasons why, this current political moment that we've been having has been so, you know, polarizing in the South is because there's it's very easy to talk about, moral superiority and past sins and so on and so on when it's not your family who's on the chopping block. It's God, I can't remember who made this quote, and I want to say it might be Faulkner, but I'm probably wrong. Um, Talking about the Civil War in particular, but essentially we have pictures of these people hanging up on our walls. It's not some abstract idea. That's this is grandma and grandpa's parents, or so on and so on. You see what I'm saying? So I just feel like things like that, explaining that people are real people is so important. Um, if that makes sense. Maybe I'm oversimplifying. The work that I do with the magazine is to try to demystify some things. And I've written many articles on that, whether it's been about the Civil War, the years right before, right after. I try to make it uh, maybe a bit less abstract and a bit more tangible. Tangible, excuse me. It's not meant to be some kind of polemic shouted at people. These are real stories, and I think that gets lost on a lot of people. And I'd imagine that conceptual view of history comes from probably the aftermath of the Second World War. I could only guess, and then probably the years following, dealing with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. But it's this cartoonish understanding of history that removes the human element. I think that's dangerous. I also think that's why good literary fiction is important, and I think that's why I love Troop's book because I think that kind of helps humanize people. um, it's really, really easy to divorce yourself from feelings when you read about, oh, General so and so moved, 1,000 guys down this ridge. Like, okay. You hear about, you know, Private, whatever, Smith and his 4 kids back at home, and the whole thing gets a different view. You find the personal diaries and the letters and letters to politicians and letters to, it's just, I don't know. I'm probably suffer from the same illness you and Troop do with the ancestor worship, but of a different bend, maybe. Anywho.
Well, I think when you value history not as an abstraction, but as something that is continuous with, the past being continuous into the present. I mean, it was Faulkner said the past isn't dead, is it even past?
Yeah.
And which I thought was perfect. And he has another quote where he talks about but history really is about our memories. And
Hmm.
I don't have that I can't give you off the top of my head, but that's something Troop and I shared. And it's not that we don't recognize the complications, the social complications that existed in those years and exist today.
Hmm.
There's more to the story than simply the conflict that existed.
Hmm.
Uh, my great great grandfather, Colonel Alfred Below, was, as I told you before we went on, was a regimental commander, 56, 55th North Carolina Regiment, and they fought in Gettysburg. And on the first day of Gettysburg, they fought at the railroad cut, at the railroad bridge, the cut, and he was injured with from a piece of shrapnel from a cannonball, and so and it was just a severe bruise to his leg, so he was not able to continue for the rest of the. But it was his regiment that was at the front of Pickett's charge on the third day, and so on the 150th anniversary, which was 12 years ago, Troop and I went up and spent 3 days there and going through the motions of what went on those 3 days. And on the third day, there was a reenactment, basically a walk, but a walk
Yeah.
by the Confederate side through the field, which was to represent Pickett's charge. And putting yourself in the physical environment that those young men, and you realize how dangerous it was, and how they were such easy pickings, and you get a feel for things that you can't even in a great movie like Gettysburg. You don't get it there. I mean, it's still over dramatized, but this is
Hmm.
a bunch of people who were defending what they felt was their honor and their home.
Hmm.
And
Yeah. Gettysburg will put that into perspective like no other battlefield. I've been to many, and that Gettysburg did something different. First time I went, there's a weight in the air that's hard to explain.
yeah, and when I go there, my daughter lives in Lancaster, and that's not far. And so when I go to see her, I try to go through Gettysburg and do that. And I go and I spend some time there at the North Carolina Memorial and think of what it was like for those people to defend something that they treasured, and
Hmm.
and where does that lead us today, and how do we defend
Hmm.
the things that we treasure today? And and I don't think we defend it necessarily by fighting and going to
Hmm.
war. I think we defend it by preserving it in the behaviors of how we live in relationship to one another.
Hmm. Well, that's one of the reasons I picked the name that I did for my magazine. It was Virginia Gentry, and there's
Tell
an
us about the magazine.
yeah,
Uh, give us
sure.
your pitch why we should be reading your magazine.
Well, it's I like it. Um, uh, I reviewed Troop's book. That's a good enough reason as any to read it. But the magazine, what well, it's
Why did you
something that I
start it? Why did you start this magazine?
just in April of last year, so it's pretty new. I had been wanting to do something for a while, wasn't sure what. And I was reading these old Southern Partisan magazines. I don't know if you're familiar with Southern Partisan. A personal favorite politician of mine was on there. Pat Buchanan was on their board at one point, and I just like the magazine. I like the Southern cultural band. So I was like, I really wish I could read this. They're not producing anything. Tried to find. They have a website up still that is awful. And I even thought about, well, could I buy the magazine? It seems pretty defunct. And then I have a friend of mine who works in the Southern publication sphere, and he told me a little bit of the inside story with the Southern Partisan magazine, and I realized that probably don't have the pocketbook to do that. So I was like, well, what can I do? And Substack's free. Um, I'd love to read Southern Partisan and I can't, so let me just do it myself. And that's kind of how it started. And but the reason that I picked the name that I picked was Virginia Gentry, is I wanted to kind of divorce the South from this caricature that's been abused. Um, people don't think very highly of the South because of the way that we're depicted in media, and that's a shame. You look even before the Civil War, the South had better classics programs in their universities than New England. Even though New England had, whatever, mathematics and engineering and whatnot. But what matters more to a civilization? That's a different argument. But but there are many of these things. And then in writing the magazine, I wrote it more to be cultural. And as I began to write more articles and get into the history, I realized, how heavy some of these crimes were during the Reconstruction and whatnot. And it really began to kind of confront my own personal beliefs about the South and things like that. So at this point, I'm sure we'd be accused of publishing Confederate apologia. I wouldn't call it apologia. But you're going to run into that anytime that you portray something that's not supposed to be good in a light that's anything other than what it's been determined to be by broader society. Um, but like I said, the people I write about were people. I actually have a great, well, I shouldn't say great. I don't want to say it's a great article because I wrote it. It's great because I love the history behind it. On the Copperhead movement, specifically in Ohio, with Clement Laird Vallandigham and so on.
Mhm.
And it was not as cut and dry as it's taught in schools. It was certainly not as cut and dry as the Barnes and Noble bestsellers make it out to be. Lincoln, you talk about Lincoln, and this isn't Lincoln um, exclusively, but just, the regime at that time in the 1860s. Uh, right at the outbreak of war, how many people were imprisoned, under the suspension of the writ of habeas without having to go to trial and without having recourse for a trial, and it's something like 13,000 dissidents, if I remember correctly. I need to revise my numbers here. It's been a while since I've read the information. But lots of political dissent. Yeah, by today's standards, if our current or former president would have imprisoned 13,000 journalists that they disagreed with, they would have been, called tyrant, Hitler, whatever. And this was par for the course in 1860. So it's just, and I think people forget how nuanced things were back then. I'm sorry, go ahead.
It sounds like I don't want to read into what you just said, but sounds like many of the issues that we face today are not new issues. They're the continuation of the conflict that has been present since the founding of the nation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, I mean, if you really want to become or look at it in an abstract sense, the Civil War was one breath of an ongoing war that started essentially with those who were in favor of a strong federal government and those who were in favor of a weak federal government.
Right.
And that was decided in 1865, but those feelings didn't disappear. And here we are today. And it's happened throughout the 20th century where you'd kind of an ebb and flow of consolidation of power and distribution of power back to the states. It'll never be what it was in the 1840s, but yeah, those forces are still at work. It's the independence, personal independence, self-help, versus centralization systems, relation, honor culture versus, I don't want to use the word empire necessarily derogatively, but, the coalescing of authority and in, in the use of power. There's a historian who I like to read a lot, and he always talks about the state and the monopoly. You know that a state is in total control when they have a monopoly on violence. So you go back to the 1820s, even up to the 1880s, and you look at like the Hatfields and McCoys. The state did not have a monopoly on violence. You could go feud with the people in the next holler over and kill each other, and it would be resolved how it was resolved. If you tried that today, you'd have SWAT teams sitting outside of your house in hours. It's a different landscape from where we came from. It's all fascinating.
Well,
And
there's
go
a lot
ahead.
of permissiveness for certain types of violence to be uh, exercised by the populace. And
Hmm.
so it's nothing is very clear cut any longer, and
Hmm.
I think that's part of what goes into a thing that I call the spectacle of the real. The spectacle of the real is simply um, a set of simulations that are fed to the public to convince them that that the way the world is operating is a certain way, well,
Hmm.
really quite different, and
Oh yeah, yeah.
it's a
I'm
what
stealing that.
go ahead. It's really the creation of a kind of a hyper reality that produces anxiety and fear
Hmm.
and a dependence upon expert opinion. And the
Oh, for
ex
sure. It's a propaganda state. This is. I don't want to say anything that I shouldn't like is too whatever, but it's that you know,
well, we're not
the
very
construct and
not very
sorry.
political here, but the reality is that we live in a let me put it this way. We're living in a time of real transition.
Hmm.
And the the interesting thing about where we are is that nothing goes in a single direction forever.
Hmm.
It tends to feed back on itself. And sometimes when it feeds back on itself, it eats itself and it destroys.
Hmm. Hmm.
And what I see is that the push for consolidation, centralization, these sort of things, ultimately fail because the complexity of the world is growing faster than the ability to control it.
Yeah,
And
it's almost like a pane of glass that can't take the weight anymore, so it's shattering.
that's right. That's a good way of seeing it. So now, for me, the answer is um, not to fight the government.
Hmm.
That doesn't work.
No, absolutely.
Instead, you build the relationships you need in your local community to care for people, to take care of them, um, to feed the poor, to provide ways for
Yeah,
people
absolutely.
to
Well, see,
develop.
this is it. Like localism is the pinnacle, and this is another reason, to love books like Troops. And I think just a more traditional Southern outlook. I mean, I don't know if you'll find this everywhere anymore, but the community interdependence. It's not socialist per se, but it's it's the willingness to stop and help the car that's broke down, and the farmer across town needs help bringing in the harvest and so on. Very, very, very important. Um, Yeah, absolutely. I think that localism is the future because if there were ever to be a calamity, which I highly doubt, but something where, our federal government were to even just temporarily collapse, you have your neighbors, you have whether it's your church family or the Ruritan Club or whoever, those are the people who you have to interact with daily. And if you are no longer able to rely on, you know, a centralized transportation system or medical care or whatever, those are the people who are going to be the ones helping you through it. I'm a big supporter of that localist outlook. I think that's another reason why I care so deeply about Southern culture is I don't want to see the uniqueness of what the South was, has been, and hopefully will continue to be dissolved and become part of this, monoculture. Um, but as you were saying, we are beginning to see, you know, uh, the centralized system fracture, and it's like I think about social media, and it's funny because some of this is pushed by algorithms, but to see how these little subcultures kind of pop up in all these weird corners of the internet, and that would have never been possible before. Um, and it's less geographic, but it's still doing the same thing. You know, but I also think it can be dangerous because then, people are in what they call the echo chamber. You're only with people like you who are saying the same things as you, and that's not always great, especially if you're saying something that's, wrong and making poor decisions based off of incorrect information. But it's an interesting thing. I think I would have gotten along a lot better if I were born 100 years ago. Just just because I think the world would have been simpler. And today it's just, I feel like it's almost too complex.
For me, it's the difference is between social connection and direct relationships.
Mm.
And we're having a social connection here, which could move into being an actual relationship. and
Yes, sir.
that's the potential that Zoom and computers and phones and these smartphones, that potential is there. And when they become that direct relationship, the 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 vehicle is no longer an intermediary, it's just a tool for us.
Hmm.
And we become in direct communication with one another. And um, that's when things change, is when we remove that intermediary step. There's a French theorist named Guy Debord, and he described the spectacle as not a collection of images, but a social relationship of images that mediate our relationships with one another, and that what we see on the screen is is informing us about how we should judge or have an opinion about someone we do not know. You know, and
Hmm.
that's the nature of this little box that's sitting in front of you and me. That's the power that's there. It has the power of changing opinion, it has the power of influencing people, But to me, I mean, this is just the way I come at this. I'm not interested in influence. I'm interested
Hmm.
in impact. What is it that you can demonstrate that you have actually changed? What does that change look like? And does it matter? And if you can't demonstrate that, then you've not taken this tool,
Hmm.
taken it to its furthest extent in being a beneficial thing for you. Because I think technology is very beneficial if we would use it for that purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's another reason that I did the magazine. Yeah. I was tired of talking to people about, gosh, I wish we had something like this, or I wish, we just something I'd like to read. I wish I could do this. And it was kind of like, well, you got to be the change you want to see. I
Yeah.
think it was Gandhi that said that, but it, you know, okay, let's do it. That's kind of,
So let me bring this kind of our conversation to a close. So your magazine comes out how often?
I try to do it weekly, but with my work schedule, it just depends. So I'd say at least three articles a month is
Okay. Okay.
at minimum. Yeah.
We'll include the address, the URL for your Substack in the
Thank you
show
very
notes.
much.
Um, the last question, as you look at the future, from there in Shenandoah County, Virginia, um, with that beautiful, beautiful pastoral region before you, where do you find hope for the future?
I think I think for me, I'd say, the young people here, um, I can't speak for everyone, but a lot of them, I think, are taking seriously, um, where they come from, taking seriously. Yeah, I talk about, family farms again to bring it all back. I think there's no more important institution in the world than the family farm. Um, and like I go to the county fair every year, usually multiple times, and I love to see the families who, because I know a lot of them, but just to see the families there presenting. And I know every time I see another family sitting with a cow or a pig for show, or for any other reason, this is the next generation picking up where their parents left off. And in many cases, this is an unbroken chain that goes back hundreds of years. I have a personal friend who's been on the same piece of ground since 1753. His family's been there, and I love that. I love that. And, um, so going forward, at least for this region, that's seeing the next generation pick up and not decide to head to Washington D.C. to find work in the federal sector, or, go to the Midwest to try to get work in an auto factory. Makes me happy to see them tough it out and continue. I have one question for you before we close.
Sure.
Uh, Raising an author in Troop. His little tiny biography on the back of Victory Ruins mentions being a voracious reader. I was just wondering if there are any books that you remember him reading and loving particularly.
That's a good question. Um, nothing comes to mind, but he was a voracious reader, and he read a lot of history. He was reading adult level history as a fifth grader. So he was prepared to do this. I don't He read a lot of history, and he read a lot of Southern history. When he started writing, I mean, when he was about 12, he came to his mother and me and said he'd like his own computer. So this is the mid 1990s, and our family had one computer, and so we found a used computer for him, and he began to write 2 to 3 hours a day, and he did that for the next 2 years, and he was teaching himself to write novels, and he wrote uh, a an alternative history of World War II, 175,000 words. You can imagine.
That's excellent.
He he wanted to teach himself how to write dialogue, and he wanted to teach himself how to write battle scenes. And the story is, um, prior to the Second World War, Hitler is deposed, and Stalin becomes the focal point of the Second World War, and it becomes clear that Stalin must be assassinated for the war to end. And so the novel is about 9 attempts to kill
Oh
Stalin.
my Lord, that's awesome.
Comrades,
Gosh, does that book still exist?
it never was published.
Oh, God, does he have it like a stack of paper? I'd do anything to read that.
You'll have to talk to him about it. He doesn't really.
I will. I will. I
Yeah.
will.
He has a copy. I have a copy, and I think those are the only two copies.
Oh, I
But
love it.
I think that I have a large library, and he would read stuff out of my library. Um, he was just voracious in reading everything he could get his hands. I mean, he used to read the Encyclopedia Britannica. We had a set, and he would just sit down and read a volume. It's so he was a sponge for information, and so and we talked a lot about this stuff, and we still do. I mean, we still do.
You sound like a great
Proud of
father.
What's that?
I said you sound like a great father.
Well, I had great children, and
Yeah, it helps.
pleased. I'm very pleased with how all three of them have turned out. And I will say this to you, JR. I made a decision when Troop was about 12, 11, that I was going to treat my children as adults. I wasn't going to treat them as children, and which meant that I was going to have adult level conversations with them at whatever age they were. And so if they asked a question, I was gonna start asking questions and have a conversation with them. And I think that created an independence in them, which has served them well in their life now. Um, Now, I don't know if I should recommend that to any other family or any other father or mother, but that's what I felt like, because I didn't want my children to grow up feeling like they didn't have a grasp on what their life should be.
Mhm.
I don't think of that in abstract terms. And I think of it in much more experiential terms. So in that sense, I'm more of an existentialist, meaning I see that what we learn that is really meaningful is through our experience in life. And then we go looking for the articulation which helps us to make sense of it. So
Mhm.
we go experience some kind of traumatic thing, and we go looking for a story, which let me give you an example. I grew up in all white schools in Winston-Salem. I live here in Winston-Salem.
Mhm.
And all the way through my senior year in high school, I was in an all-white school. They had not desegregated the schools at that point. But my senior year, they brought in a new head football coach, and he was a black man, Baxter Holman. And he's one of the greatest men I've ever known. And what we watched in his behavior as our coach and as a man and as a black man was how you maintain your dignity and your integrity when you're under threat.
Hmm.
And the racism that was inherent in the system, not only in the coaching system, in the coaching staff, but in the school itself, it was obvious it was there. There were other black professors, teachers at the school, but he was in a position of authority, and
Hmm.
and so we watched how he handled that, and we'll talk about it to this very day, how we all learned what it means to live a dignified life, and
Hmm.
um, and so when I went off to Chapel Hill to school, I didn't know what I was going to study. I ended up as an American Studies major. And I remember sitting in the second floor of Peabody Hall on a Friday afternoon in freshman English class and watching a civil rights march go by the building. And I looked down at that civil rights march and I said, wow, that's really interesting. I didn't have, because of growing up in an all white environment, essentially, I didn't have the exposure to things like that, which would have given me a sense of, oh, well, that's just another civil rights march. No, I looked at it with great curiosity.
Hmm.
And ultimately, I ended up taking two courses in African American literature, which was African American literature from the 19th century through the 20th. And it was fascinating to read their stories and realize how much of that there were things about their stories which were true of my story. That
Hmm.
there was this commonality, and so I think that if I'm this is a long explanation. Um, so I think what I'm saying about Troop and what he read is he read a very diverse set of stuff, and I think that's what we should do, and we should read it not to critique it or to
Hmm.
defend something or to look for confirmation of something that I already believe, but rather to be curious and to say, that's interesting. I need to learn more about that. And
Hmm.
um, and it and so I don't see any of the political ideologies, for example, that are current today being very relevant to my life
Hmm.
because I don't I don't it just doesn't work. So when I moved back to I'm just kind of filling this story in. So when I moved back to my hometown a year ago, I moved into a neighborhood that is probably two-thirds African American,
Hmm.
but they're my neighbors. They're not
Hmm.
they're not black people. They're my neighbors, and we care for each other. And and I think that goes that storyline right there, I can trace back through the generations, back through the pre-Civil War era in my family.
Hmm.
So I think if that is a bundle that we tie and put a bow on it, there is something about the history of our lives and the history of our families and history of the regions where we live that is worth not preserving as some kind of artifact, but rather
Hmm.
investigating and being curious about it and learning why it mattered and why it matters still today.
Living tradition, absolutely.
Living tradition. So yeah, I'm looking forward to Troop's got two books that he's working on now, and hopefully they'll be finished soon. And I look forward to reading them.
Man,
So
me too. I love his
or
work.
reading the Virginia Gentry, and I like the name.
Thank you.
I think it's really a good name.
Thank you.
So thank you for being with us.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me, Mr. Brenniger. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. And thank you all for watching. I hope this is instructive. You've seen a part of the world that probably you've never known, particularly if you live outside the US. But it's real and it's here. And it's worth discovering without prejudice. If you can do anything without prejudice, then you're going to be a far better person, and you're going to have a chance to be a person of impact in the world that you would never have imagined. Because our prejudices, whatever they may be, are the things which limit our lives and limits the ability and it creates trauma, and it creates anxiety and fear, um, and none of that's healthy for us. I think you would probably agree, JR.
Yeah.
So we'll see you next time here on the Eddie Network podcast. Thank you. Bye-bye.